Today is Thursday, 26 September, and as I did with my program yesterday, before turning to the topic of the conflict in Ukraine, which will take up most of this program, I get to say a little about the gathering crisis in the Middle East. Firstly, we still continue to receive reports of heavy exchanges of fire. It's an understatement, actually. Massive missile and bombing attacks by each side across the Lebanon border. Of course, Israel, which is has a conventional military with an air force and far more powerful missile forces, I suspect, at least air defense missile forces, maybe not strike missile forces, in any exchange of fire is always going to put down much more heavy damage on the other side than Hezbollah can do. But I've been reading articles in the British media, in the London Times and the Daily Telegraph, talking about a massive network of tunnels and bunkers, underground bunkers, apparently created by Hezbollah, under the territory of southern Lebanon. In fact, there's an eyewitness report from somebody who's been inside one of these tunnels. And there are reports that despite the fact that Israel has been doing massive damage by its bombing strikes and its missile strikes, the underlying military force of Hezbollah has only been dented. And, well, again, I'm not a person with expert knowledge on Hezbollah's capabilities, but I would not be surprised if this was true. And, well, Israel, in the meantime, apparently has just rejected a ceasefire proposal from the United States and France, a proposal for a 21-day ceasefire. Both the Israeli Foreign Minister, Mr. Katz, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, have rejected outright this proposal for a ceasefire. And apparently the head of the Israeli army is telling Israeli soldiers to prepare for a ground operation in southern Lebanon. But I wonder whether the real difficulties for Israel will begin once this ground operation starts. And I say that because, again, one of these reports that I read in the British media basically spoke of Hezbollah fighters apparently saying about the prospects of an Israeli ground operation. Basically, their sentiment was, bring it on, that the Israelis will be fighting on Hezbollah's territory, on Hezbollah's chosen ground, and that Hezbollah has trained and prepared for this sort of operation for many years now. Well, I say all of that. Of course, it's important to reiterate again that for the moment, it's Israel that is putting down the heavier firepower on Hezbollah. But Hezbollah, allegedly, with 100,000 rockets in its arsenal, can probably outlast this kind of major missile and bombing offensive. And as I discussed in a recent program, it is likely that Israel's air defense capabilities lack the level of resources and resilience such that they can continue to withstand Hezbollah missile and rocket attacks that continue week after week, month after month at the present rate. Just saying. Now, it's important to say that Hezbollah has problems of its own, and perhaps Iran has even bigger problems. The Financial Times is reporting, and I think this report is probably true, that the Iranians have had to send representatives to Beirut to talk to Hezbollah, to reassure Hezbollah that Hezbollah still continues to have Iran's full support and backing. There is enormous anger, apparently, on the part of Hezbollah, the fact that Iran appears to be leaving Hezbollah in the lurch. That may not be true, but it is a perception that many apparently within the movement have, that Iran has not acted to defend Hezbollah, just as it has not acted to respond so far to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. And the Iranians apparently are having to to provide some kind of reassurance to Hezbollah that Iran will continue to provide such support to Hezbollah as it can and as Hezbollah needs. What the form of that support will be, I am not going to try to speculate. And one can sense behind all of this increasing murmurings of criticism of the Iranian President Pezeshkian. He's made more statements. He went to the United Nations. He made more statements there talking about a potential resumption of the nuclear negotiations with the West, of Iran's desire for to reach some kind of understanding with the West. And apparently these Iranian representatives who've been sent to Beirut, partly, apparently, at President Pezeshkian's instigation, are having to assure Hezbollah that these statements that President Pezeshkian has been making at the United Nations do not signal any change of policy by Iran with respect to Hezbollah and with respect to Israel. And here one can see that, to some extent at least, the tactics that the Israeli government has been following, the major bombing attacks, the strikes on Hezbollah, are having a certain effect. They're causing divisions within the so-called axis of resistance, the one that brings together Hezbollah, Iran, and the various other Shia militias across the Middle East. Iran is coming under increasing criticism, and President Pezeshkian, who sought to build on the diplomatic momentum achieved by his predecessor, Ebrahim Raisi, apparently to reach out to some extent to the West, is now finding himself, by all accounts, in an increasingly difficult position. And I mentioned the various articles that have appeared in the British media, in the Daily Telegraph and Reuters, which appear to suggest problems with President Pezeshkian's position in Iran, and which might, by the way, have been deliberately published in order to heighten, to aggravate his problems. And one way or the other, I do wonder how President Pezeshkian is going to respond to all of this and what exactly it is that he intends to do. Because I also believe that one of the purposes of this major Israeli attack on Hezbollah is to do the very thing that President Pezeshkian apparently fears, and which some other people in Iran apparently fear, which is to provoke Iran into action, which the Israeli government of Prime Minister Netanyahu can represent as aggressive and threatening towards Israel, enabling Israel to gain the support of the Western powers for an all-out war of some sort against Iran. So whatever the long-term military prospects of the campaign against Hezbollah that Israel is currently undertaking, one can see that there is a purpose behind the strategy, and to the extent that this purpose is both to create divisions between Hezbollah and Iran, and also to provoke possibly a crisis in Tehran, moves perhaps against President Pezeshkian, possibly, but also ultimately to force Iran into preemptive action that at this time it doesn't want. Well, that might also play into the strategy that the Israelis, or at least the Israeli government, is pursuing at this time. Whether in the long term, if the Israeli government gets what I am confident some of its members want, which is a conflict with Iran, even one in which Israel has the backing of the Western powers, if that happens, whether it will be ultimately for Israel's benefit, and I'm being again very careful in my choice of language, as I'm sure you realize, whether it will work to Israel's advantage or to the advantage of the current Israeli government and of the various people who make it up, I very much doubt. To repeat again what I said in my previous programs, it seems to me that this course is only going to compound Israel's diplomatic and security problems. It won't resolve them. Anyway, this is what I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East at the present time. It remains a very dangerous and very fraught situation. It could easily escalate into an all-out war. In fact, as I've said already, I think partly the purpose of this is to make it escalate into an all-out war. And if that happens, well, I suspect that we're going to find that Western governments who are already becoming frustrated and exasperated and divided between each other over the conflict with Ukraine are going to find that they have an even bigger problem in the Middle East that they must contend with without any very clear plan of how they should do so. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in the Middle East. Let's turn now to the situation in Ukraine. And before we do, let us discuss the news from Moscow, where the Russians, or to be more precise, President Putin, at a Security Council meeting in Moscow, this is the Russian Security Council, yesterday, disclosed significant and important changes to Russia's nuclear weapons doctrine. I should make it clear, nuclear weapons use doctrine. How the Russians, what are the events that would cause the Russians to use or consider use of nuclear weapons? I should say it is made very clear, apparently, in all the documents, not all of which we've been published, but about which we've received fairly detailed commentaries, including from people like Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and prime minister, who now heads the United Russia Party, the ruling party, and who is, of course, deputy chair of the Security Council. Anyway, he's published a commentary, and he makes it clear that the ultimate decision, despite the changes in nuclear doctrine, the ultimate decision will be the president's, specifically Putin's himself, Putin's own, as to whether or not, in any given situation, nuclear weapons are actually used. But anyway, what are these changes? As I said, Putin explained them in fairly brief comments reported by the Kremlin's website at the Russian Security Council. And I can say very briefly that they are these. Firstly, the new doctrine, which has not yet been fully signed off, though that seems like a formality now. The new doctrine says that if Russia is attacked by a non-nuclear weapons state, which is, however, allied with and supported by nuclear weapons states, then the Russians will treat it as if it was a nuclear weapons state, and that will determine their decisions about whether or not to use nuclear weapons. Previously, as I understand it, under the earlier doctrine, the Russians would only use nuclear weapons against other states that had nuclear weapons. Now that's been expanded to include countries that do not have nuclear weapons themselves, but which are allied to countries which do have nuclear weapons. And of course, we all here assume that this refers to Ukraine, and perhaps, probably it does, at least to some extent, in fact to a great extent. And I've no doubt that this is the country that everybody had in mind when the changes to the nuclear doctrine were discussed. But in theory, it could extend to other countries also. So let us say, for example, that Poland, and we'll see why that might be one country, Poland or Finland or the Baltic states were to undertake some kind of, or find themselves in some kind of conflict with Russia, which the Russians were to say constituted a military attack upon themselves, just to say. The Russians could say, well, these countries are allied with the United States and Britain and France through NATO, and that even though this was an aggressive attack, so that Article 5 of the Washington Treaty might not, in theory, apply. These are, of course, all very far-fetched scenarios, just to make clear. But the Russians could say that the fact that these countries are in alliance with the United States, well, that would justify the Russians taking decisions to use nuclear weapons against them. Now, I said it's very far-fetched, but it is not beyond the realm of the imaginable. There's been a great deal of discussion and debate recently in various corners of the internet, including places that, do discuss military aspects fairly intelligently or very intelligently, about perhaps a conventional operation by Poland, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, all of these countries, against the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, for example. And it's been suggested that if these countries were to attack and occupy Kaliningrad, which they might construe as a danger and a problem for themselves, but were to use only conventional weapons, then the Russians might not retaliate with nuclear weapons because it has up to now been outside their doctrine to do this. Well, from now on, if there is a conventional attack of that kind against Kaliningrad, nuclear weapons could be used under the new doctrine that the Russians have just announced. Just to say, as I said, I think myself that there are no plans to attack Kaliningrad, at least no developed plans to attack Kaliningrad, or perhaps I should correct that and say no intentions, no present intentions to attack Kaliningrad by any of the countries I have mentioned, Poland, Finland, Sweden, the Baltic states. But, as I said, it has been debated. And as I said, to the extent that it's been debated, that idea has been out there, and this covers that possibility. Now, the second change to the nuclear weapons doctrine is that it's not just enough for conventional weapons to be used, but it makes clear that for the Russians to decide to use nuclear weapons in the face of such an attack, including, by the way, if the attack were actually undertaken by a nuclear power, well, it would mean the Russians would do it if very large numbers of missiles and drones and other conventional weapons were used for attacks on Russian territory, such as might call into question the existence of the Russian state. I don't myself consider that this is a major departure from the earlier doctrine. But anyway, it's been made explicit. And of course, a lot of people are saying that this is somehow connected with the debate, the ongoing debate in the West about whether to authorize Ukraine to use missiles for deep strikes against Russia. And to some extent, it is, in the sense that the Russians, by making this change in their doctrine, are basically saying to the Western powers, well, we've already made it clear that if weapons like this are used against us, because we consider that only you are in a position to assist the Ukrainians to use these weapons, and that you must actually develop and design and participate in the launch of these weapons. So that would be an act of war on your part. So the Russians are reinforcing the warnings that they've been making about the West assisting Ukraine to carry out deep missile strikes against Russia. So to some extent, this change in the doctrine is a warning to the West on this issue. But I don't think this point should be taken altogether too far, because one of the things that has been discussed in the media recently, in the United States media and the US media specifically, is that there are so few of these missiles now available in Ukraine, so few Storm Shadows, and so few ATACMS missiles, that if Ukraine were to be given what it wanted, and deep strikes with these missiles were to be made against Russia, supposedly Ukraine would run out of missiles in just a few days. It would not be able to maintain a sustained offensive against the Russians. And I have to say, if that is true, then that does not accord with this change in doctrine. The change in doctrine appears to require mass missile assaults, something much closer to what we're currently seeing on the Israel-Lebanon border than the kind of thing that Ukraine, with Western backing, might in theory be capable of. Of course, if the United States were to decide to supply hundreds of ATACMS missiles, which perhaps it could, I mean, they do exist, then that picture might change. But I don't think so. ATACMS missiles are said to be overall in short supply, and it seems that the United States, despite the fact that it's announcing a big arms package later today, apparently doesn't seem to be willing to go down that track. Of course, drone strikes. Ukrainians have conducted very large drone strikes across Russia, but as I've discussed many times, these are pinprick attacks. And frankly, for the moment, these two do not seem to me to correspond with, to fit the kind of scenario that this change of doctrine outlines. But there is a third point about this change of doctrine, which I think is the most important of all, which is that the Russians are now saying that for the purpose of nuclear use weapons doctrine by Russia, the territory of Belarus is going to be treated as identical to Russia's. And Putin has said that this is explained by the fact that Belarus is in a union state arrangement with Russia. Well, you can put aside the legal justifications for treating Belarus as in effect Russian territory, but the fact is that the Russians have now publicly extended their nuclear umbrella to Belarus. They have said that any attack on Belarus is an attack on themselves and will be treated in exactly the same way as an attack on themselves would be, and that extends to the question of nuclear weapons use. So this is a very dramatic development because especially because President Lukashenko of Belarus has been talking, well, for years now, ever since the political crisis in Belarus in 2020, about various plots, intentions, plans by various NATO powers, specifically Poland, but also other NATO powers as well, and by the way, Ukraine most recently, to undertake a military offensive, an invasion of Belarus as well. And what the Russians are now saying is, don't even think of doing that. If you do, we would respond. We will respond perhaps initially with conventional forces, but if Belarus were to be placed in jeopardy, we would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons, and doctrinally, we are entitled to do so. Now, there is an important extra dimension to this, which is not actually discussed in these new policy decisions, but which is extremely important to bear in mind. There is constantly in the West a distinction made between what are called tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical, medium-range, strategic nuclear weapons. And these relate to the security thinking of the United States. So the United States calls nuclear weapons that are used on battlefields, say battlefields in Ukraine. Not that I think the Russians have any plans to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but say on the battlefields in Ukraine or in Europe, but which are nuclear weapons specifically intended to be used on the battlefields. They call these tactical nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons which are mounted on missiles or aircraft that could operate in Europe or the Middle East, say, but which could not reach the continental United States. The Americans call these intermediate nuclear weapons or medium-range nuclear weapons. And lastly, there are nuclear weapons which are installed on intercontinental bombers and on intercontinental ballistic missiles and on nuclear weapons submarines, which, if the Russians were to launch them, could reach the continental United States. And the United States calls these strategic nuclear weapons. The Russians have never adopted those distinctions. As far as they're concerned, all nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons. And this is important because there is, I think, still a belief in the United States that if there is a nuclear war in Europe, that won't automatically extend to include them. Well, in the event that we find ourselves in that kind of catastrophe, that a nuclear war in Europe or on some European battlefield is taking place, that may be what the Americans think. And, it's not something I want to imagine or talk or think about. But it may be an incorrect or complacent assumption. It could very well be that once orders in Moscow are given to the various commanders to start using nuclear weapons in the combat, and assuming that the United States and NATO starts to respond, I can very well and very easily see how, according to Russian doctrines, that could escalate very rapidly all the way up to the point where nuclear weapons start being used against the continental United States. And then, of course, we would be in the ultimate nuclear apocalypse, which I absolutely do not want to discuss further on these programs. So, these changes in doctrine that Putin has just announced are important, and they do affect the United States as well. The United States, for example, if it were to greenlight an attack on Belarus, and I want to make it very clear, I don't believe that any such plan or intention exists. I don't believe that anybody, at least I hope, nobody in Washington is debating such an idea. But, I don't know that for sure. But anyway, if anybody in Washington has that kind of idea, has the idea that giving, say, Poland the green light to invade Belarus, and again I want to say I don't think the Poles have any plans to invade or any intentions to invade Belarus, but we're talking about hypotheticals. If the United States were to think that if they gave the green light to such a plan, not only are the Russians saying that they would use nuclear weapons to defend Belarus if they needed to, but it could very, very quickly escalate to the point where it affects the United States itself on its own core territory, the continental United States. Anyway, these are troubling developments, very, very concerning developments. They highlight the extraordinarily dangerous situation in which we find ourselves today in the modern world. That Putin, in his comments to the Russian Security Council, made the point that the Russians have been driven to make these changes in doctrine because the West, the United States, people in the West, don't seem to be taking deterrence as seriously as they once did during the Cold War. And on this, I have to say, I agree to him. I find every single statement made by a Western commentator or a Western official or a Western politician, people like Boris Johnson, for example, telling us that any discussion of nuclear weapons use in Moscow, any warning or threat, if you prefer, of nuclear weapons use from the Russians, from Putin himself, is merely a bluff which we should call and disregard. I think that person is gambling in ways which I cannot even begin to imagine. And we have seen with these announcements in Moscow, the first result of these reckless statements that have been made in the West and the unending escalation that they seem to advocate. We see the first fruit of this in these, frankly, deeply concerning changes to Russia's nuclear weapons use doctrine. And to be frank, I would call on these people straightforwardly to stop. Not that they will pay any attention, but they need to stop. They should stop, because whilst they continue to talk in the way that they do, even if the escalation itself doesn't happen, the escalation that they relentlessly advocate doesn't happen, they're merely pushing the Russians to make still further changes to their nuclear weapons doctrines, which I think it would be far better for the security of humanity that they were not made. Anyway, there we go. So that's concerning news from Moscow. Let's now, however, pivot to New York, where all the world leaders are gathering, or many of them are, not everybody. Pezeshkian, as I said, is there. Lavrov, by the way, is representing the Russians. I believe Wang Yi is representing the Chinese, but all sorts of other people are there. President Zelensky, of course, is there. And a few hours after the making of this program, he is due to meet President Biden of the United States, and he's going to bring up his plan, his victory plan. And already now there's been an authoritative article in the Wall Street Journal saying that the Americans have looked at this plan, that as far as they can see, it's not a plan at all. It's just a wish list. It's more of the same, more demands for more weapons and more escalation. And it's already very clear that the Americans, that the United States, that the Western powers are not impressed at all with this victory plan. But that, of course, leaves the United States, leaves the administration in a difficult position because they have invested a huge amount in Ukraine. And of course, they're not, as I've discussed in previous programs, fully united on this issue. We have hardliners like Secretary Blinken, who seems prepared to escalate to the most extreme and dangerous levels. This was discussed in that article by Joe Laurier in Consortium News that I've discussed yesterday. We have the Pentagon, who are much more unhappy about about Blinken's aggressive ideas and Zelensky's escalatory demands. Joe Laurier, again in Consortium News, discussed this all in a masterly fashion in that article that I've also spoken about. So anyway, the Americans themselves are not divided. And of course, the president himself, Joe Biden, one senses is viscerally heavily invested now in Ukraine. He doesn't like Putin very much. I don't think there's any controversy about that. In fact, he dislikes Putin intensely. That's my own take. He's been enthusiastic in his support of Ukraine. He's given Ukraine, he's signed off on one weapons package after another. He's crossed his own red lines in terms of the weapons that he's been prepared to send to Ukraine. Well, perhaps he will heed at least some of Zelensky's demands. Maybe, and I hope he doesn't, but we can't be sure, maybe he will go against the Pentagon and tell Zelensky, okay, we agree that you can use missiles for deep strikes against Russia. We'll probably try, given we're talking about the Biden administration, perhaps we can impose all kinds of conditions on what sort of targets you can strike and that kind of thing. None of which, by the way, is going to impress the Russians in the slightest. It doesn't respond to the concerns that the Russians have expressed, that the use of these missiles would be an attack by the West on themselves, just saying. But maybe the Americans will come up with something complicated and elaborate like that. Maybe they'll say to Zelensky that they agree to it, but that they won't announce it, which is a foolish idea being floated in the British media. Maybe they'll come up with all of that kind of thing. Or maybe not. Maybe the Pentagon will prevail, and the fact that they are clearly strongly opposed to this idea will be enough, at least this time, to prevent it being implemented. I would like to think so. Anyway, we'll see what happens. We'll see where all this goes. We'll just have to wait and see what President Biden is going to do. The one thing we do know is that he has authorized, apparently, a massive allocation of funds to Ukraine. He's apparently going to release the remaining, some say $5.5 billion, others say $6 billion, others say $8 billion out of the $61 billion appropriation authorized by Congress in April. He's going to authorize that entire fund should now be released for weapons supplies and every possible thing that this money can buy for Ukraine. He's going to authorize that to be provided to the Ukrainians. So Zelensky will be able to come away from this meeting with Biden with lots and lots of money, or at least promises of money, and of course promises of extra weapons as well. But whether he's going to get the green light for the deep missile strikes, that we'll have to wait and see. We have heard a report, there has been a report that the White House, presumably Jake Sullivan, but the president as well, have gone against one recommendation from the Pentagon, which is to allow the Ukrainians, to supply the Ukrainians with shells that include white phosphorus. And this is a curious announcement because apparently the Pentagon has recommended it, but the administration has refused. One does wonder a little why that decision has been made. Is this a conciliatory move to the Russians? Is it an attempt to tell the Russians that, actually we're not escalating, we're pulling back, in fact, paving the way maybe for future discussions with the Russians? Is it a warning to the Ukrainians? You can't expect more from us. We're not prepared to do any more. Is it intended to signal to the Pentagon that even though the president is prepared to authorize deep missile strikes against Russia, which the Pentagon opposes, he's not looking for an all-out conflict with Russia, as the Pentagon fears, because he's not prepared to give Ukraine phosphorus shells? Or is he worried, is the White House worried, that the use of phosphorus shells in Ukraine would have a political effect which might be damaging shortly before an election? I'm not able to say which of these it is. It is an intriguing decision. It's the first time I can think of that the administration has refused to supply outright a weapon that the Pentagon was prepared to supply to Ukraine. And it may signal some shift in policy, but again, I think we'll have to wait and see what it actually means. Now, all of this is happening against the backdrop of President Zelensky's visit to the United States. And I said in my program yesterday that this visit is turning into a debacle. And we've had further proof of this over the last couple of hours. Now, in my program yesterday, or maybe the day before, I said that I thought that President Zelensky's comments about J.D. Vance seemed to me unwise and could be construed as electoral interference in the elections in the United States. I'd underestimated the extent of the American reaction. The Republicans are furious about this. There's been criticism of Zelensky himself by people like Lindsey Graham, Donald Trump, of course, and Speaker Johnson of the House of Representatives is now complaining about the behavior of the Ukrainian ambassador, who he says is busy organizing events that are apparently intended to influence the election, to which the Democrats are invited, but to which Republicans are excluded. And Speaker Johnson has even written a letter to President Zelensky demanding that President Zelensky sack his ambassador. Pretty strong stuff from the Republicans. So we can see that Zelensky's actions in the United States, and perhaps those of his ambassador, are proving very counterproductive. They're solidifying hostility, certainly towards him personally, on the Republican side, even though Speaker Johnson went out of his way to say in his letter that Republicans and Democrats do continue to support Ukraine. So anyway, that was one false move. There's been another very remarkable, very extraordinary false move that President Zelensky has taken, which is that the Brazilians are now apparently pushing forward with their plan to convene a meeting later today of countries of the global south. This is going to be in New York on the fringes of the UN General Assembly session, at which the Brazilians are going to outline their peace plan for Ukraine, one which they claim has China's backing. In fact, it's been described by the Brazilians as a Chinese-Brazilian peace plan, though I notice that it is only the Brazilians who are actually convening this peace plan. And to be frank, there are things about this plan about which I know very little, but there are things about this plan which I think the Russians would not be happy with. For example, the plan apparently calls for an immediate ceasefire along the existing ceasefire lines, conflict lines, an immediate ceasefire to be followed by negotiations and then further moves to de-escalate the conflict. And the Russians are not happy with this. They don't want something like this to happen. They are winning the war. They're making major advances now in eastern Ukraine. They are close to capturing places like Vuhledar, Torets, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, all of those places. They certainly do not want their offensive at this moment in time stopped in its tracks, because President Lula of Brazil wants them to. And of course, beyond that, the Russians have had bitter experiences of ceasefires, like one that they briefly announced shortly after they started the special military operation in February 2022. They have bitter experiences of ceasefires, which have resulted in negotiations which have led nowhere and which have resulted in resumptions of the fighting after the Ukrainians have been able to catch their breath and reorganize and have put themselves in a better defensive position in consequence. So the Russians will not look favorably, will not be happy with this Brazilian proposal. The Russians, however, are very skilled diplomats, and they understand that they cannot afford to reject proposals like this one from President Lula outright. Putin has already said that even if they don't like every aspect of this plan, they would not be completely averse to go to a ceasefire eventually, provided the Ukrainians withdraw completely from the four regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. And the Russians have also said that they are happy to sit down and talk to the Ukrainians at any time, though there will be no ceasefire unless and until the Ukrainians do withdraw from the 4 regions. So the Russians probably, in fact definitely, not happy with this proposal from President Lula, but careful not to criticize President Lula directly and publicly, saying that they will consider this proposal as it is made and looking to pick and choose those parts of the proposal that they can work with, like the suggestion for negotiations, even as the ceasefire part of the proposal they're making clear is unacceptable to them at this time. Well, having said that, I feel that at this particular point, when, as I said, the Russians are conducting a successful offensive, they would prefer that proposals of this kind, like this one of President Lula's, were not being made at all. Well, who comes to their rescue? None other than President Zelensky. He has made a further speech, apparently at the United Nations, in which he has been, again, incredibly abusive about Brazil and about China. He said that he can only imagine that the Chinese and the Brazilians are intending to attack some country or other because they come up with proposals of this kind. He has again rejected outright any suggestion that there should be a process of the sort that President Lula is now proposing, and he has repeated that the only peace plan that Ukraine is interested in is the one which works towards the outcomes set out in Zelensky's own peace plan, which is the one that requires the Russians to agree for a complete pullback of all their forces from every millimeter of pre-2014 Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Lugansk, with negotiations about what one wonders only beginning afterwards. This summary of President Zelensky's words does not convey the strength of President Zelensky's comments. Again, gratuitously insulting of countries like Brazil and China, to a degree that I find remarkable in the context of diplomatic negotiations, or at least diplomatic discussions. And one wonders what President Lula is thinking about all of this. Maybe he's just not paying too much attention to what President Zelensky says. But anyway, the point is that this adamantine rejection from the Ukrainians, from Zelensky himself, makes the Russian position much easier. They don't have to go out of their way to reject Lula's proposal because Zelensky is doing it for them. Yesterday, I said that President Zelensky is at risk of annoying everybody, of annoying people in Kiev, where he's now coming under heavy criticism, again, in light of all the military setbacks that Ukraine is suffering. He is exasperating many of his Western allies, the Germans, the Italians, perhaps even the French. He is also creating tensions between himself and the United States. He's making enemies on all sides. He's antagonizing the global South. He's infuriating the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians. And by the way, he didn't have very nice things to say about the Indians either. So he's doing all of this. I'm going to suggest that the only party that perhaps wants him to remain where he is is Russia. From their point of view, Zelensky at this present time is the gift that goes on giving. They might be in a very awkward position at this present time, faced with a peace plan promoted by President Lula that is likely to gain some traction and which they would be embarrassed to reject outright, especially on the eve of a BRICS summit meeting due to take place in Kazan at the end of next month. But as it is, President Zelensky is helping them instead of making their life complicated. He's coming to the rescue of the Russians by rejecting outright a proposal with which the Russians themselves are not happy. Anyway, there we are. Now, it should be said that it is not just President Zelensky who is behaving in a most undiplomatic way in New York at this summit, at this General Assembly meeting. The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has also made comments at the Security Council, the UN Security Council, which I do not intend to discuss in detail. But again, they appeared to me so absurdly undiplomatic, so absurdly unhistorical, that I personally, as a British citizen, found them deeply embarrassing. I could not believe that a British Foreign Secretary would talk to the UN Security Council in that sort of way. The Russian representative, who I presume was Vasily Nebenzia, responded by sticking his mobile phone to his ear and pretending to be talking with somebody else, even as David Lammy was speaking, an extreme sign of disrespect towards a Western representative. Might have been Lavrov, actually, now that I think about this. But anyway, as I say, an extreme sign of disrespect. And I suspect that on this issue, given the kind of language that Lammy was using, the Russian representative probably had the quiet approval of various other representatives also attending the Security Council meeting. What I will say about this speech was this. I'd say two things. Firstly, David Lammy needs to understand that diplomacy is not the same as British domestic politics, and what might come across well before a sympathetic audience in Britain on some kind of stump speech does not play well when delivered in the very different kind of conditions of the UN Security Council. That's the first thing I will say. The second is that he, and by the way, other British diplomats or Foreign Office people, need to remember the words of Talleyrand, the famous foreign minister of France during the period of the Napoleonic Wars and after, the man who was always in power in Paris, even as all the regimes constantly changed around him. And he was one of the greatest diplomats of any time. Anyway, Talleyrand was once asked, what is the worst possible quality that a diplomat might have? And he replied, an excess of zeal. And that is a lesson that I think David Lammy needs to learn. An excess of zeal, to put it mildly, is what he showed. Anyway, there we are. Let's not spend any more time on these diplomatic maneuvers at the UN, complicated as they are. My own view, by the way, is that they're going to come to absolutely nothing. I think that the Americans probably will not, this is my own sense, I think that they will not authorize the deep strikes with the missiles against Russia. I've changed my views many times about this, and I'm not saying this for certain. It's a difficult one to read at the moment. But I think that the Pentagon is so strongly opposed that it is unlikely to happen. So I think that nothing will come of that. Nothing will come either out of all of these peace proposals that the Brazilians are making and that others are floating. I think that very soon we're going to revert back to the situation on the front lines where the war continues and where Ukraine continues to lose that war. And it is to that which I will now turn. And here I'm going to say again, the situation for Ukraine on the battle lines is getting worse and worse all the time. There is an extraordinarily difficult article to read in the London Times today, which discusses the situation of Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting close to the hamlet of Andreevka in the Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians pulled back from this place a couple of days ago. The Russians confirmed it. I've been bewildered what the Ukrainians were still doing there, given that all the places nearby, Klishayevka, Kurdyumovka, all of those had fallen under Russian control. Anyway, it described an absolutely terrible situation of exhausted and broken Ukrainian soldiers faced with an overwhelmingly more powerful Russian army held together by one determined Ukrainian commander, aged 25, by the way, facing impossible odds, soldiers complaining about the constant Russian drone attacks and the fact that they are outgunned and outnumbered, and that the Russians have all of the advantages in the fighting. Shortly after, as I said, this article, the reporter who wrote this article, shortly after this reporter spoke to all of these soldiers, in fact, we got the news that the Ukrainians had indeed withdrawn from Andreevka. And the article says that none of the soldiers are at all interested in Zelensky's victory plan or take it seriously or are thinking about it. They have little to say about the Kursk operation. They say that as far as they're concerned, it has made absolutely no difference to the situation that they are confronting. It seems that all of President Zelensky's maneuvers or his various actions are impressing no one currently on the battlefront, at least amongst the soldiers, this group of soldiers that this reporter from the Times spoke to. But what is going on the battlefronts? Well, the key events are taking place around Vuhledar. And apparently a officer of the 72nd Brigade, the lead brigade defending Vuhledar, and I think it's now universally acknowledged that this brigade is still in Vuhledar. Anyway, the officer of the 72nd Brigade said that there's around 2,000 Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar, made up from troops of two brigades, one of which, of course, is the 72nd Brigade. And there is now no doubt at all that they are completely surrounded. The Russians have captured, according to the maps that I've seen, around a third of Vuhledar. They control all the roads, including the dirt roads leading in and out of Vuhledar. When I say they control them, I'm not saying that they occupy every one, but their drones, their mortars, they're buzzing over all of these roads all of the time. Any attempt by the Ukrainians to escape Vuhledar now would encounter horrific losses. And it is possible that some Ukrainian troops are indeed trying to escape from Vuhledar. There's apparently pictures, I haven't seen them, of a single Ukrainian tank trying to flee Vuhledar northward. It was detected by the Russians and destroyed in the fields or on one of the dirt roads. But anyway, the situation in Vuhledar is catastrophic. I don't think anybody expects Vuhledar to remain under Ukrainian control, or any part of Vuhledar to remain under Ukrainian control for much longer. I think we're probably counting hours before Ukrainian resistance in Vuhledar collapses, though it may take some time before the Russian Defense Ministry confirms the fact, because I suspect that with such a significant number of Ukrainian soldiers trapped in the town, it will take some days before the Russians are able to clear all the basements and all the cellars and all of the various places and sort out all the booby traps and the mines and all of that, and are able to say that the town has been completely secured, such as would mean that the Russians can say that they are in control, or as the Russian Defense Ministry likes to say, have liberated it. So it is a terrible battle. One can see pictures of the storming operation that the Russians are now conducting in Vuhledar, but one sees also in that part of Vuhledar that is still under Ukrainian control, if that is the right word, relentless shelling and bombing with the TOS thermobaric weapons heavily used, fab bombs raining down. I mean, it is unimaginably terrible what must be taking place to the Ukrainian soldiers who find themselves caught under all of this. It reminds me, I must say, of the last days of Avdiivka. It's the similar type of situation that is playing out now, except that Vuhledar is much more completely surrounded than Avdiivka ever was. And I've also seen photos, and these are only photos, not film, of some of the Ukrainian prisoners that the Russians are capturing. And apparently they're capturing quite a few. And I have to say, the look of these soldiers, the condition of these soldiers is shattering. They look completely broken in spirit, broken in all kinds of ways. I don't want to further explore or discuss. So Vuhledar, the battle for Vuhledar, definitely now coming to an end. And of course, it is only part of one battle. The Russians are also, importantly, advancing north of Vuhledar to all of the various other villages nearby. It is clear that once Vuhledar falls, the Russian offensive in this area is not going to stop. Very much like what happened when Avdiivka fell, the offensive will continue and will perhaps even intensify. And I personally believe that the Russians intend to continue advancing all the way to Kurakovo, further to the northeast, capturing all the villages in their way. And apparently there are also reports that the Russians are now pushing north, a little west, in the Vremivka salient, which is not very far from this area where the Battle of Vuhledar is playing out, and that they're pushing northwards to in the direction of Velika Novosilka, this village, which was the main logistic position of the Ukrainians for their offensive against the Vremivka salient. And again, I suspect that once Vuhledar falls, we will probably see a Russian offensive towards that village from multiple directions as well. And we also hear rumblings that group of forces Dnieper, the 130,000 men under the command of General Teplinsky, are waiting to pounce, and this could all be connected to the events in Vuhledar. So, as I said, a terrible battle playing out there. I think that we are probably hours away from the moment when the main fighting stops, though mopping up operations might take some days, just to say. Now, as I've discussed in many programs, the Battle of Vuhledar must be understood as part of a bigger battle taking place right across the whole Pokrovsk, Kurakovo area. Yesterday, I said that there were some reports that the Russians, which I thought might have meant that the Russians had broken through from this village of Gostre that they've captured west of Kurakovo, and that they might have actually reached the Kurakovo reservoir. I've seen no confirmation of that over the last 24 hours, so I'm going to guess that some of those reports were overambitious, to put it mildly. But anyway, in this general area, after the fall of Zelensky, the village that the Russians captured a short time ago, and of the Selidovo prison, and the capture of Gostre, it's clear that the Russians have largely occupied the fields to the north of Krasnogorovka and west of Novolsk, which had for many years been occupied by the Ukrainians, and where many thought that the Ukrainian troops were trapped in a cauldron. I've always expressed doubts about this, but it looks as if, in fact, the Ukrainians had pulled out of these fields, as I expected, that the fields were empty of Ukrainian soldiers, that the reasons the Russians have taken their time to clear this territory is because of Ukrainian mines and Ukrainian booby traps and all of that. But it seems that they've now largely occupied these fields, shortening their front lines. And it looks as if the Russians are now outside the village of Tsukurinye, and that they are going to prepare an assault upon this village of Tsukurinye, west of Ukrainsk, south of Selidovo. And as I've discussed many times, if Tsukurinye falls, it opens the way for a Russian storming operation of Selidovo itself, which will almost certainly follow fairly quickly, and also of a Russian operation possibly to start encircling the Ukrainian troops further south in Kurakovo as well. And Kurakovo, very much now at risk of becoming a cauldron. The Ukrainians are about to lose 2,000 of their best troops in Vuhledar. They risk losing even more men in Kurakovo and in all the nearby villages, unless they now make the decision to withdraw to more secure and more defendable lines. Just saying. And further north in this general area as well, in the Pokrovsk area, close to Pokrovsk, I've seen reports that the Russians have now completely captured the village of Nikolaevka, just south of Mirnograd, and that they're clearing the various fortified positions that the Ukrainians have hurriedly dug in the fields just south of Mirnograd. They've apparently already captured one of these fortified positions. And a storming operation of Mirnograd quite plausibly could begin within the next 1 or 2 weeks, maybe. And then, of course, that will just leave Pokrovsk. And as I said already, I don't think the Ukrainians are in any condition to defend Pokrovsk for anything like as long as some people think. Well, there's been less news from other parts of the battlefronts. In the Toretsk area, for example, there were some reports that the Russians are now pushing westwards towards closing up this salient that the Ukrainians have between Ocheretine, which the Russians captured way back in March after the fall of Avdiivka, and Toretsk itself, that they're clearing the village, approaching the villages, Alexandropil and all the others, strung out along the main road leading to Konstantinovka. It's been suggested that if the Russians do this and clear these villages, then there is open fields to the north of these villages, which will allow the Russians to complete an encirclement of the remaining Ukrainian troops in Toretsk itself. My own view is that the situation in Toretsk is already critical, way beyond what's going on in these places, but we're getting fewer reports about this. There's lots of film of massive Russian bombing of places like Kupiansk, of Siversk, of the villages around Siversk. The Russians look like they're in the early stages of preparing an assault operation, obviously intended ultimately to capture both Kupiansk and Siversk. We've had no news over the last few hours from Chasiv Yar, though I suspect that once the situation in the Western front lines becomes clarified, we're going to learn that Chasiv Yar also is about to fall. And further north, less news from the Kharkiv direction. The Russians have pulled out from the aggregate plant in Volchansk. The Ukrainians have occupied this place, but they're being heavily bombed and shelled by the Russians. What the Russian plans are for Volchansk now, I don't know. But in the meantime, the Russian commentaries are now openly saying that the Russian objective in Kursk region is to capture Plekhovo and Sverdlikovo and to encircle the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region, and that an operation to achieve that objective is being prepared and will be launched at some point within the next couple of days. And it could be that the reason the Russians have pulled back in Volchansk is that they've decided that destroying the Ukrainian force in Kursk region needs to be given higher priority, because the Russians can achieve a decisive result there, surrounding and destroying a force of perhaps 10,000 Ukrainian troops, whereas in Volchansk it is still a hard and painful grind, and a decisive result would take weeks or months at the current rate to achieve. That's just my guess. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation as I see it on the various battlefronts in Ukraine. Obviously, the most important news comes from Vuhledar. The psychological effect, the morale effect on the Ukrainians, if this town is lost, is not to be underestimated. And it is contrary to what the Institute of the Study of War and others are claiming. It is a place of huge importance, strategic importance. It will unlock the entire southern Donbass, and it will, for the Russians, it will enable them to sort out their logistics problems, and it could make possible a further Russian offensive in the same area, ultimately targeting the city of Zaporozhye, even as the other big city on the Dnieper in this general area, Dnipro, might also become vulnerable once Pokrovsk falls. You can see how methodically the Russians are taking all the important squares on the chessboard, removing the key pieces that the Ukrainians have one by one, even as they probably prepare for a checkmate move, just to take the chess metaphor to its ultimate point. And all of the maneuverings, all the discussions in New York and elsewhere seem to me to be irrelevant to all of this. And according to that report in the Times, the Ukrainian soldiers themselves think so. Well, there we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and also links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.